Okay. Hi, everyone. It's Joey Johnston on behalf of Siegel Speakers, where we seek to bring you interesting guests to talk about their experiences in life, sports, business, and some things you can learn. Today, our guest is Jim Steeg, the former Senior Vice President of Special Events for the National Football League. And his primary responsibility for most of those years was putting on the Super Bowl, which was one of the greatest tasks anybody could undergo in the world of sports or the world of anything. Jim, welcome. Glad to see you again.
Great to see you. It's been a while, Joey. Good to always see you.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, you saw the Super Bowl specifically on your watch from Super Bowl 14 through Super Bowl 39, and obviously the game was big when you took it over and was even bigger at the end of your tenure at the NFL. Could you describe how it evolved in your time? I mean, again, when you took it over, it was a pretty big thing, but how did it evolve in your time overseeing that game?
Well, I think the word evolve is the key thing there, because a lot of things change over a period of, quarter of a century and how you get there. And I was fortunate enough at the beginning to have a great boss in Pete Rozelle, the commissioner of the NFL, and then Paul Tagliabue, who came in, and in a lot of ways, both of them gave me a lot of freedom to be able to experiment and try things. And I think the other thing that really makes the Super Bowl different than a lot of other sporting events, maybe aside from the Final Four, is that you're going to different venues. And I think over my 26 years, we went to 12 or 13 different cities to host it in. And they each bring a unique flavor, but they also bring unique challenges and opportunities. And the good ones stay attached and the bad ones get jettisoned and you move on. When I started, the game's focus was primarily what it was. It was, the 3 hours of the game, and, it was up with people doing the halftime shows. And probably somebody, I think one of the first Super Bowls involving, like Helen O'Connell did the national anthem. So it was celebrity stuff, but it wasn't really big time like it was. So we tried really hard to change, what took on in that 3 hour time frame. And that evolved over time from, I think the first real big celebrity we had for an anthem was Diana Ross in '82, but, now that's become a thing and everybody's there. And then the halftime show, which took a little bit longer, going through becoming a spectacular, to really being forced into getting the megastar involved with it, because Fox had ambushed us in 1992 with a show called In Living Color, and we wanted to make sure that never happened again. And we ended up with Michael Jackson the next year, so that changed the halftime. So a lot of that was focused there. Then it was focused around the fact that when you come to the game, it's not just about, the game itself. It's what goes on the time before, the hours before, and that sort of stuff. So we started up with a lot of help in Tampa, the first time around, with setting up corporate hospitality, which nobody had really done before. And I think we ended up in Horizon Park there in Tampa with about 8 to 10 corporate tents. We'd had like 2 or 3 in Pasadena the year before. And so that really involved that, and then what you could do to make the fans have more going on inside and outside. And we tried to innovate in and around game day. The first Jumbotron or Diamond Vision was installed for an NFL game in Pasadena in '83. I mean, we did things like put sound in the concession stands and the concourses, and put television sets in the concession stands, and all sorts of little things that we could experiment with to make the experience of the game better. And then the next step was realizing that the hotels were looking for 3 or 4 day minimums. Is what do you do with those 3 or 4 days to make people have something to do? Not that they couldn't find things to do, but create things for them. And we started with the NFL Experience, which is, our version of Disneyland. And that Now that draws about 200 to 250,000 people during the time that it's open prior to that. And that brings out a lot of the locals into what goes on, and the kids participate. We started sponsoring different events around town, sanctioning events. I think we got as high in Phoenix in '96 as 106 different events. I realized that might have gone a little too far when all of a sudden we had the official Super Bowl burro race. That was time maybe to wind back and find things that made more sense. But things like Taste the NFL, which now has been active for almost 30 years, has raised untold millions of dollars for hunger relief and food banks. But there's a very simple concept there. We had other things like the Passion for Fashion, a fashion show put on by Rodney Peete and Holly Robinson Peete. All sorts of things that were there that gave people something to do in and around the communities. And then I think the host committees went to become even more than that. And they added events. They wanted to make sure that the cities came off as good as they could. And, so it's grown, and now we've got major concerts going on in and around all week. And, there's something for somebody to do, because I always said that the thing about a Super Bowl fan or an NFL fan is I can't tell you their demo. And so we kind of have to have something for everybody in that process. And that's, I think we could be successful if 4 guys get on an airplane at the end of the game. And one guy says, I had the greatest experience. I sat 10 rows up on the 50-yard line and watched the game. And another guy says, no, I had the greatest experience I ever had. I sat in the bar and watched the whole game, So it's everybody's got their own thing that makes them happy. And it was kind of creating something for everybody to make them happy.
As we all know, the Super Bowl is much more than a football game. It's such a defined part of American culture. And people have talked about we should make the Monday after the Super Bowl a national holiday. You hear things like that. How would you just generally describe what this thing has meant to America and Americans, this football game that's so much more than a game? What does it mean to our country, and what is its place in our culture?
Well, it's interesting because when you look back on how it started, I think, Rozelle had an image that what he wanted to create with it. And he wanted to take it to, quote, the entertainment capitals of America. So he spent a lot of time in Los Angeles and Miami, Miami being kind of the East Coast New York in the wintertime, with the Gleason show and things like that going on down there. And so taking it to warm weather where people could get away, and it was far enough away. It was the next thing after New Year's that you had to look forward to celebrate and be around. So I think the timing was always very important, what was there, what was taking place. And, we were entertainment. We were fun. I mean, it's a great culmination for, the football season. But I think what really started in a lot of ways was for a lot of businesses, particularly the auto companies, it became a place to celebrate their last quarter, their entire year. You could get the best salesman, for Ford Motor Company for the year, and then put them on an airplane and send them down to, Miami to go to the Super Bowl. And so a lot of the stuff that originally started was that the corporate entities that ran contests to become part of it. So I think it became something to look forward to. I think the fact that what we tried to do with the entertainment was to make sure that it was all not one demo. The grandmother sitting in Iowa had something to watch that was the same as, somebody that was sitting in New York watching it. And it became appointment television in a lot of ways, and there was something for everybody. But I think it's really never became, I think when you got to Super Bowl 25 in Tampa, when all of a sudden we were, in just beginning the war in Iraq, it became a rallying point for everybody. And the NFL was always good at wrapping itself around the flag. And I think that was important to do at that point in time. It's funny because going into Super Bowl 36, which was the next time, the one right after 9/11, we had talked about the fact maybe we've got to get a little bit further away from, that Americana type thing, go a little bit different. but obviously Super Bowl 36 brought us all back together to celebrating America. So I think the fact that it was around those events that took place that were really important. We weren't very political. I think the only time we ever got political was over the Martin Luther King, holiday that was not passed in Arizona, and then we pulled the game out of Arizona until the holiday was passed. That was the only time I think that we ever really got political. Although I remember once Roselle, strangely, wanted to put up, was it Lech Walesa in Poland, had the Solidarity movement back in the early 80s, and he wanted to put a banner up to celebrate that. I think that was the first time we ever did anything of that sort. But it was something to celebrate, something to have a good time. And then we were fortunate enough that, great partners with the networks, the fact that people jumped on in the early 80s, like Apple with the commercials, and now the commercials become almost more popular than the game. That they're made specifically for the game, that type of thing, which really adds stuff. I mean, you can think back to, it went from not just people involved in football or products, but remember NBA players, like Larry Bird had the commercial and Michael Jordan had a commercial, and all that put in that added to it, and that kind of gravitated for all the other sports and everything to come together. So I think that was really, it just became something that was there at the right time, at the right point, for where we were in the country, coming back, like I said, from New Year's, and everybody was looking forward to the next holiday. And I think we did a good job of providing it.
For somebody who spent most of his life coordinating the Super Bowl, how many angles, how many different approaches did you get from people from all walks of life saying, "Can you get me some tickets?" How often did you hear that? How did you see every scammer known to man, in other words, over the course of your career?
Oh, yeah. Everybody tried to come up with some sort of way to get in and get it done. And I learned I had more friends from high school and things like that than I ever knew I had in those days. And people I supposedly knew in college that I had no idea who they were. But, and it was fun. I tell you the one funny story, the toughest ticket that week was the commissioner's party, which was held the Friday night before the game. And I used to always, having enjoyed the fact that I was fairly anonymous, I'd work will call at the commissioner's party, because that was where you heard some of the great lines. And I'm working will call at the game in New Orleans, and this guy comes up and he says, I've got 2 tickets left here. Will call. Jim Steeg left them for me. I said, really? I said, well, when did you talk to him? I said, well, I talked to him this afternoon, like about 12 o'clock. I said, I was with Jim at 12, and I know he was in a meeting with the commissioner at that point. No, that was like 3 o'clock. I said, no, but I know he was over at rehearsal, for the anthem and the pregame stuff for that. And so I said, well, let me go back and check. And Jan Van Duzer, who worked with us in the league office, goes up to the guy and says, you do know who you were talking to. And that was the end. That guy disappeared very quickly. But, there were a lot of those things that took place. And I think some of the scams to come in, and there was a credential. Remember the old days of when you got your mattress, there was a tag attached to it that had be on the back of it, do not destroy, do not light, all these things. And it was a guy that must have torn the tag off the mattress at his hotel and had handwritten the front of that stuff to look like a credential. And he bulldozed his way past security, and there he was, on the field with this pass, the back, made sure the back was turned all the time, which would look like all the conditions you've got on the back of a credential anyway, never really at the front. And I remember walking up looking at him, and obviously tore it off and sent him packing. But there were a lot of novel ways for people to get in there, and part of that was fun. I mean, we had the great imposter. You might remember him. He was a guy by the name of Barry Bremen. He was out of Detroit, and he had snuck onto the Cowboys game dressed as a cheerleader. He'd gone through warm-ups at the NBA All-Star game. He was catching fly balls at practice at the Major League Baseball All-Star game, out in the outfield. We had him at the Pro Bowl one time. He showed up at the Pro Bowl dressed as Lem Barney, which I remember one of our guys is sitting there looking down there going, wow, isn't that great? Lem Barney made the Pro Bowl, his last year. And he looks at him and he goes, wait a second, Lem Barney retired like 3 years ago. Wait a second, Lem Barney's black and this guy's white. What's going on? So he was going to, we're in Detroit and everybody's worried about him sneaking into the game. And so NFL security had a tail on him the entire week, which I don't quite understand. And it got to game day, and he had a party at his house, and security supposedly watching him, and they lose him. And all of a sudden, I get a radio call from somebody at one of the gates saying, is the San Diego Chicken allowed to come into the game? And I said, of course, hell no, it's not. Turned out that Barry Bremen was trying to get in as the San Diego Chicken, so we did. But everybody had a way to get there and be part of it.
Yeah. As the game has grown, how do you balance keeping it a football game for fans versus growing corporately, growing in every other area? And I know that's something that has changed over time, but how do you keep it a football game that will appeal to a fan yet appeals to the masses as well? Where's that balance?
Well, I think the most important thing we got during the game, there's a lot of stuff going on, is taking care of the two teams. The one thing about the league, we've got years to get ready for that game and know what we're doing. The teams literally, in some cases, like we had in Tampa in 91, we literally had less than 24 hours from the time they won the championship game to get there. So we really focused on making sure for the players and the coaches and the staffs that they had everything at their disposal they would have normally. And because they're going through, talk about fast forward all the way through this thing, to get going. And it's not just the fact that they've got to come down and practice and adjust that sort of stuff, but they got families and ticket distribution and buses to plan and parties to plan and, all that sort of stuff to do. And so taking care of the teams was really critically important. We spent a lot of time making sure the practice fields were perfect, that they had everything in their locker room they would need, all the weight room equipment, all that sort of stuff. Although a lot of times the weight room equipment we put in there, it sat there, never got used. You get that late in the season, guys aren't lifting. But if we didn't have it, they were going to complain. I remember the Bengals had won Super Bowl because I think Pete Brown, Paul Brown's son, was affiliated with Nautilus, and he wanted to bring all his weights in, for that or something like that. And he brought them in, and I don't think they were ever touched. But there they were. And it was a pain in the neck to get them in and get them out. But so I think that there's a lot of doing that. I think that the key with the fans was always we tried to control the prices as best we could. As far as you take the price of the ticket and keep it where it was, try to control the hotel prices by letting them charge, the top end of their rack rates on their rooms and not go beyond that. Same things like limousines and buses and all those things that you try to take control of. The old days of there's two menus at the restaurant, one for the guests and one for the locals. You tried to make sure that stayed the same price. So we wanted to make sure it was affordable. Now, I think that's probably a lot different right now because the price of the ticket now probably averages $2,500 to $3,000 a ticket face value. I think when I left, it was top ticket was $600, which was still a lot. But, I think it's gotten higher and things to get there. But you wanted to make it so that it was affordable and there was something going on and there was all, you could handle all sorts of issues. And it was the experience, this whole thing, him very well, Leonard Levy, there in Tampa, was chairman of the host committee there in '84. And I remember him coming back after the game. He called me like on Monday and he said, that was the greatest game I've ever been to. I said, Leonard, it was 38-16. It was over the minute, Squirick intercepted, Theismann on the goal line, ran it in for the end at the end of the first half. He said, no, the game was the greatest thing. I just said that. That's the game. He said, no, I mean, for me, for him, it was when he pulled his car out of the garage to when he pulled his car back into the garage. It was we had the Florida and Florida State bands performing together, which had never happened before, something like that. And it was that experience that he had and all the people he saw, and whether it was people he wanted to see or it was the fact that he could see some celebrity going by. So, like I said, that really struck me at that point, made me understand how important it was for that entire game experience. But it also meant a lot when I ended up going to the Chargers, that helped me understand for them their experiences, like when you leave the garage and when you pull back in the garage, and how you keep the person entertained in doing that.
Yeah. From the entertainment standpoint, there's so much interest and attention in who sings the national anthem and who's doing the halftime and how good was the performance. How highly did those positions become for entertainers to get to do that? How competitive was it, and how did you go about finding the people to do those halftime and national anthem performances?
Well, I think after it's funny when we got Diana Ross, because before that, like I said, we had Helen O'Connell and we had Tom Sullivan and the Colgate Five and people like that doing the anthem. And I remember going in to see Roselle prior to the Detroit game in '82, and I said, there's only one person that could sing the anthem in Detroit, and that's Diana Ross. And he kind of looks at me and says, "Well, good luck, kid. Go ahead and try and get her." And so I did. Literally called up, knocked on the door, went and saw her, and she said yes. And that changed the anthems in a lot of ways, who we ended up getting. And for me, part of it was almost like you're watching the Grammy Awards, and you go down the list of the Grammy Award winners, and you make an ask of somebody that's hot at the time, from having gotten a Grammy. And that was what we did in a lot for about 10 or 15 years. And we went after people we couldn't get. Mariah Carey, it's funny, we never asked Mariah Carey until we got to Super Bowl 36, but she turned us down numerous times, even though we never asked her. Like the media would call her and say, "Are you going to sing the anthem?" I said, "No, I'm not," or something like that. And we never asked it, that type of thing. But it was, I can't think of anybody that really turned us down. I know when we got Neil Diamond to do it in Pasadena in '87, talking to his agent, this guy's name was Sal Bonafetti, and he basically flat out turned me down. And then I realized that he had a relationship with Eddie DeBartolo. So I called Eddie and asked Eddie if he'd place a call. All of a sudden, I remember driving up the Pasadena freeway and getting a phone call on a car phone with Sal Bonafetti. All of a sudden changed his mind, and he was totally into Neil Diamond singing the anthem. He understood what it was. So sometimes they didn't understand what it was and the power of what it was. I said, you can play in front of 120 million people in this country, and God knows how many million otherwise, and it's a big moment. And I saw it in a lot of them because I can think of Harry Connick Jr. Was going to sing it a cappella and all that sort of stuff, and then all of a sudden he gets out in the middle of the field, and he's got his father about 10 feet away lip-syncing the words to him. So he could remember what they were, because as many times as they performed, all of a sudden this is a lot bigger than I thought it was. But I never had anybody ever say that after they sang it, it wasn't one of the great experiences of their life. Now, the halftime was a totally different thing. We were into extravaganza probably all the way through the 80s. And that was, we were in competition for the Orange Bowl, the King Orange, parade, halftime show. Those were the two that were the biggest ones, and they were spectaculars. And Disney did a number of them for us. Disney did a number of them for them. The magical light parades and all those things that you would see at Disney. And it all changed, like I said before, with Michael Jackson. And then for a while after Michael Jackson, there was a lot of people that didn't want to do it because they were afraid of it. They thought that they couldn't compete with what he did. And it took, ironically, probably took till Diana Ross 3 years later when she did it in Phoenix to change everybody's minds that, yes, I can see how I can play in front of 70,000 people in the round and make something out of this thing. And of course, now the success of, all the people that have come through it, from McCartney to the Stones to Bruce to, run through the list of people. That it's a bucket list for most entertainers right now to do, and it's a challenge for them to make themselves bigger than anybody else. But it really has become, and I think it's funny. It was there were in the '80s. I was never home on New Year's Eve. I was always in New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl, or I was in Pasadena for the Rose Bowl, or I was in Miami for the Orange Bowl, or something like that, to see what those games looked like. But there was one time that I was home and I went out to dinner with friends, and all they peppered me home the whole dinner on New Year's Eve was who's going to be in the halftime. Mm-hmm. So it made me understand how important that was to people, even back in the '80s, and of course now it's even more so.
Yeah. For somebody who grew up as a big sports follower and worked for the Dolphins, worked for the NFL, your background is all sports. What was it like to kind of enter that entertainment world and deal with entertainers and agents? How different is that than the sports world, and what sort of different skill set did you need to deal with folks like that?
Well, the good news is I had the power of the NFL behind me, and the second part, I had my heroes that you kind of looked up to, that you wanted to see. They were the athletes. So the entertainers weren't I wasn't as awestruck by them. Few exceptions like McCartney or somebody like that, but most of them, I was fortunate enough that when you went the laundry list of people that I ever wanted to see, like the Beach Boys or something like that, we got them to all to perform at some point in time in my life. I remember the last one we had was I was big into Creedence and John Fogerty, and we booked Fogerty my last Super Bowl in Jacksonville to play the tailgate party. And I remember the woman I had in my office in charge, I said, "Who the hell is John Fogerty? I've never heard of him." And I said, well, when he plays his songs, you're going to understand it. And she said afterwards, "Oh my God, that was the best set we've ever had at a tailgate party." When you start playing all the Cole Creedence stuff. So I think I never was really in awe of them. And I think you could call me, the only one that was really frustrating for me was Springsteen. And I really wanted him to perform in the worst way. And I went through every means possible. I knew his agent really well. It almost got to the point that it was a joke that we talked to each other 2 or 3 times almost every year. And Bruce didn't want to do it. And then I got to different members of the E Street Band and talked to them, and they wanted to do it, but Bruce didn't want to do it. And of course, soon after I left, Bruce did. So it was, to me, that was one that I missed out on, but we certainly pursued that all the time. In most cases, it was just a matter of them understanding more about the game. I mean, the biggest thing with Michael, for example, when we met with him, he had no idea what the Super Bowl was. I mean, no idea. The football game, he couldn't tell you if the football was pumped or stuffed, let alone, what's going on with the game. And we're sitting in a meeting with him, and we say, this game's going to be seen live in 180 plus countries. And he looks at it and he says, "You mean people are going to see my performance in this in places I'll never do a concert?" I said, "Yes." He said, and I think that was the thing that all of a sudden pushed it over the top for him to do it. So, and in the entertainment world, a lot of them didn't know, about the Super Bowl or what it was. And I think they had to go back and look and see what other people did to go, "Wow, this is really big." And I think they probably would all say this was one of the highlights of their careers, the ones that have done halftimes.
Yeah. How do you judge a Super Bowl? In other words, all the Super Bowls you were involved in, there were incredible classic games, maybe games that weren't as close. Are all Super Bowls great, just different? I'm sure you have your favorites, and you have your ones that maybe you wish things would have gone differently. But how do you, when it's all said and done, whether it's the football, the entertainment, all of it, how do you judge how it all went? And does it all always go pretty well? It's just a little different in every city?
Well, it's funny. After my first one in Pasadena, I went to the Pro Bowl. And I'm there in Hawaii, and like Wednesday morning, the phone rings, and it's Carrie Roselle, Pete Roselle's wife. And she said, "How did everything go?" I said it was awful. There were 100 things that went wrong going on with that. And she said, "Well, does anybody know about any of those things?" I said, "Well, no, they don't. There are things that we could have done better that we didn't do better and stuff like that." She said, "Well, I think you're going through postpartum." maybe that was the way it happens. And so, yeah, I think that when you evaluate them, publicly, you don't have to worry about selling out because that's going to happen. Television ratings have a lot to do with it. But I think Rozell's philosophy early on was, I've got to have these other things like half times and things like that around the game because I can't help it if a game ends up 55-17. They're not all going to be 20-19 with a field goal missed on the last play of the game. And so that's going to be remembered for the game. And that's kind of the way it was. If it's a great game, Vinatieri kicks a winning field goal or something like that, everybody's going to talk about the game. But if it's a bad game, they'll be talking more and more about halftimes and anthems and other things they experienced with it. So it's always, I think the other stuff supports the game. And if the game itself doesn't carry it, then it's got to be the other things that make it happen. And all the pieces put together, to me, I always thought if you attended the game, I wanted them to go back to wherever and 5 years later look back and say, let me tell you what really takes place, what's going on and how special that was. And that could be as simple as the fact that, they gave us all seat cushions, to sit on or something like that. And I don't get that anyplace else, so you wanted to make it special.
Yeah.
For me, evaluating the success of the game, I don't know. There were ones that were more fun, ones that were more rewarding, maybe a lot having to do with what was going on in the country at the time, or things that I still think the Detroit game in '82, I think of fondly because that was the very first game I saw from the award of the game all the way through to pulling it off. But then again, the problem it had awful weather, which we overcame, but still we had awful weather. And we learned a lesson in that game that how to deal with the Secret Service, because the vice president came to the game and the Secret Service didn't listen to a word we said about how to get him to the game. We talked about helicoptering him in, going in the counterflow of traffic. Instead, they do what they always did. They stopped all the traffic to get his motorcade through. I guess the funny part of that was the 49ers offensive bus was behind the motorcade. And so they didn't get there on time. There was a point in time we realized that if 49ers won the toss, they're going to kick off because the only guys that were there were his defense. The bus obviously got there on time, finally got there, but we learned how to manage those things. And when I think the next time we had a vice president was Gore. And ironically, they were easy because the toughest thing in that game, which was '94 in Atlanta, was we had a baseball player, better known as a basketball player, that came to that game. And Michael Jordan had more attention and caused more parting of the seas when he walked around than anybody I think we ever had, at the game. Any celebrity that we ever had, Jordan was the one that created more awe. And it may be partially by being 6'6", and you could see his bald head walking through the crowd or whatever it was. But that entourage was something special.
Yeah. Let me ask you one final thing on this segment. There have been 3 commissioners to be in place for the Super Bowls, all different people, but there's only one guy that was there at the beginning, Pete Rozelle, who helped usher in the game, who certainly had a great understanding of television and marketing and helped grow this game to heights that people didn't imagine. You got to be around him a lot with a working and personal relationship, and he's certainly an iconic figure all time in American sports. Hard to believe he's been gone as long as he has been gone. But what do you take away all these years later from being associated with Pete Rozelle? What did he tell you and give you that you take with you in your life today?
Well, his moniker kind of was, you do things with class and style, and then everything else will follow. And if that meant spending a little bit more money to do it right, you're going to get it back in the long run because you did it that way. And that was always the way we did it. He was, I saw him 10 days or so before he died out in San Diego. And literally what he was sitting there asking me about was what was the plans for the Friday night party, who was going to do the halftime and all that sort of stuff around the game, because he thought that was so important. And he wanted to do everything right. And he wanted us to be a leader not just in the NFL with what we did and an innovator that way, but he wanted us to be an innovator and a leader in sports and a leader in that across the world. So he was very much into experimenting with different things. I mean, one of the funnier stories that ever happened at the very beginning, if you remember, they played the first game at the Coliseum. Yeah. And in the old peristyle end, the clock had hands on it that went around. And they were so excited because they figured out a way to run the clock remotely from the field. And so they kept going out and showing everybody, look at this, we can start it, we can stop it, this and whatever. And then on Saturday, they're going through it and they're showing it off again. Literally, the hands of the clock fell off because they're worn out by metal fatigue. But that was, always try to find something that was different and unique in what was taking place. And, I think he enjoyed, the attachment when we do somebody to toss the coin and it was somebody, a legend of the game, coming back because that tied the past into what was going on, in the present. Those guys are one of my first jobs I ever had was, since this is almost playing back on 1920, George Hallis tossed the coin at Super Bowl 13 and he came out in the Hubmobile. And I think that, and it was funny because Hallis kept wanting to get out of the car and we knew that was going to take too long. So we had to have him toss the coin from sitting in the car. And then he wouldn't, then he wanted the coin he wanted to give the coin to, I forget whoever won the toss, Dallas or Pittsburgh. He wanted to give the coin to them and said, no, we want that. It's got to go to the Hall of Fame. And he wanted his own coin to use. But I mean, I think those are moments with people that were special, Marie Lombardi and Red Grange and just, legends of the game, Bronco Nagurski, stuff like that got to do that. And, guys like Bobby Lane, I remember when he did it in Detroit, we had to make sure he stayed sober long enough in order to get him out on the field because Bobby was a notorious drinker and he and his kids would literally stand on the sideline with drinks in both hands before he went out for the coin toss. But I think he really was into the attention to detail and tying the past to the present and making sure that we were being creative. And when we did in '83, we were coming off the 9-week strike in '82, and I had seen a concert outside of LA called the US Concert, which was the first time I'd ever seen portable jumbotron screens used, for a concert. And it was really only one stadium in the entire country that had a jumbotron, and that was Dodger Stadium. So I got a connection and hooked up with the guy from Diamond Vision, a guy by the name of Mikio Matsubahashi, and said, can we put one in temporarily into the Rose Bowl? And he said yes, and it was going to cost about $100,000, which was a lot of money in those days. And so we planned to do that. Well, now we go on strike. And I remember coming out of the strike, I went in and talked to Pete and I said, well, you still want to do this? He said, hell yes. We're going to do this the best we can possibly do it. And that was the first NFL game that you ever had, replay inside the stadium. And the next year, I think there were 8 jumbotrons in NFL stadiums. So it was the beginning of what took place. But that just gave you an idea of him wanting to do something innovative and creative.
Yeah. He's Jim Steeg, the former Senior Vice President of Special Events for the NFL, Mr. Super Bowl, who oversaw the growth of this not only game, but American iconic event. We're going to have more with Jim Steeg in our series. Thank you very much, Jim, for talking to us today on behalf of Siegel Speakers. It's been great. And we'll hear more from Jim in our next segment. Thanks for watching, everybody. And look forward to seeing you again.
That was great.
Okay, now we'll just go into our, okay. So can we just transition into a talk about Super Bowl 25?
That's perfect. Just give me another 30 seconds to make sure the internet connection is stable on my end.
Okay.
Okay, all right, I'm going to mute myself, and whenever you gentlemen are ready, you can keep going.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's Joey Johnston on behalf of Siegel Speakers. We're here today to talk to Jim Steeg, the NFL's former senior vice president of special events, the man who oversaw the Super Bowl for 25 years, the growth of that great event, great game that we all know so very well. Today, we want to talk specifically about one Super Bowl that was very unique, Super Bowl 25, which was held at Tampa Stadium. A great, great game. The New York Giants defeated the Buffalo Bills 20-19, and everybody remembers the game. But another thing to certainly remember was the backdrop of what was going on around the world. The Gulf War was taking place. There was a great fear that the Super Bowl might be a target of some terrorist activity. There was great security surrounding the game. A lot of things that maybe we're associated with now and familiar with now that we just saw for the first time ever in that game. So not only football, but world events were swirling around this game. And it all came together for a day and an evening that none of us who were there will ever forget. Jim, first of all, welcome again. Glad to see you.
Great to see you.
Jim, Super Bowl 25, I know you'll never forget that one. It was a little different. So you're preparing for this game in Tampa. And even before we know it's the Bills and the Giants, there's a world event going on, a conflict over in the Gulf region that maybe might threaten whether this game can even come off. What was going on behind the scenes in talks, and was it in fact a real threat to the Super Bowl being played? Was there a consideration that maybe the game wouldn't be played?
Well, the discussions took place at one point in time. I mean, that was a very unique game in that, like you said, I want to say that we bombed in Iraq like on Monday or Tuesday of that week. We knew something was going to happen, and there was a lot of grave concern taking place. I think the NHL All-Star game was played the weekend before in Old Chicago Stadium. I remember telling the guys in our office, you need to watch that in order to see what the reaction is by the crowd taking place there. And of course, the tradition there at Blackhawks games was literally for them to yell and scream during the whole national anthem. So I knew there would probably be a plus to that because they would think that would happen. And obviously that happened during that. So, but there was a lot of discussion taking place. There was conversations back and forth with people in the White House, with President Bush, what should be taking place. And I think the unique nature of being in Tampa had a lot to play in it. You had MacDill Air Force Base there, which was kind of the center of command for what was going on, and a lot of the military personnel that were, in the Middle East had families in Tampa because of living at MacDill. So I think that had a lot to do with it. I know the one thing that was a casualty at the time was the halftime show. ABC, in my mind, I mean, there's a lot of things that take place with it in that this was Tagliabue's really kind of first Super Bowl. He was elected in November of '89, so he was there for New Orleans in '90, but now all of a sudden '91 is the game that he's now overseeing the whole thing with. And in a lot of ways, there was a lot of a learning curve he had to go through. And ABC had a real interest in making sure Peter Jennings got 25 minutes of airtime at halftime. And so they pushed saying that the halftime was not appropriate. It was done by Disney and completely redone after everything what they're originally going to do, more of a salute to the military and things about that. But that went all the way, it got decided by ABC and the NFL not to do it. I'll never forget Tagliabue saying, "Will you go call this guy Eisner and tell him we're not going to show the halftime?" How things turned, since obviously Eisner became, broadcast, Disney became owners of ABC and ESPN, and all of a sudden became, one of the lead partners of the NFL. But we ended up, Eisner went all the way back up to the president trying to get him to change the mind of everybody. It went that way. And ended up showing the halftime show after the game. The game ended, then the halftime show was shown because there was such a clamoring to do that. But it was a very unique experience about watching it as everything was ramping up at that period of time, going to war. And, the precautions you took, I think we prepared for a lot of things. But the other thing, being in Tampa for the second time, I always felt comfortable there. We had great leadership in the community, so we pushed the envelope on a lot of things. For example, the NFL experience, which now attracts about 250,000 people, each year to that, started that year in Tampa. I think we had 73,000 people in an event we called NFL Town Square, which was the precursor for the NFL experience. So that's taken place outside the stadium. The corporate hospitality villages had grown, quantumly. Didn't have much of anything in New Orleans the year before because it's New Orleans, everything's nearby at the hotels. All of a sudden, we've got this massive growth of corporate hospitality taking place. And so there's a lot of things we experimented with to get better with that game that really were important. And then all of a sudden, you have this hit us, and there was this tremendous concern about I don't know why when I look back on it, that somebody was going to fire a Scud missile into the stadium. Obviously, that was far and far, far between. How are they going to Scud missile in the United States? So I think those Scud missiles, remember, the Iraqis just fired them up in the air and they hoped they landed someplace.
Yeah.
How they were going to have one take off from Orlando and land in Tampa, I don't think so. But, we had jets flying in the airspace that if anything came in like that to knock it down. And so, it was a very, very difficult time to get there and a concern for everybody. But I said it turned out to be a spectacular experience. And, go into other details of things, everything from Whitney Houston to the security plan to everything. And then there's some real funny moments in it too.
Yeah. Speaking of security, I mean, now when we go to sporting events, we're very accustomed to going through security lines, going through metal detectors, all of that to enter a stadium. And then we were not. This was one of the first times any of us had experienced anything like that. What was it like to execute such a security plan, and how do you think the fans reacted to it on game day? What did you see?
Well, I think the fans were very considerate, knew what was taking place. Those were all hand wands that we had to go through in those days because they weren't magnetometers like you've got now. But everybody had to get hand wanded in there. And I think they were very accepting of the process to get in. They came in early. We tried to plan things going on in the stadium. The good news is between the scoreboards and things like that, we could really keep things going active. So people came in early. There was still a point that we had a crush at the gate, 15 minutes prior to kickoff, which we've already started our pregame show at that point in time, that we kind of lowered the standard and said, okay, just let them in. I think we were past the point of worrying about somebody coming in at that point in time with the problem when we got that big a crunch. So we did lower the standards so we could get everybody in time for kickoff. I'll give you one, side story, a couple side stories that took place with that is, there was a concern, and if around the stadium we put, the big Jersey barricades that you see in the middle of a highway, the concrete, extended blocks there in the highway, and we had those scattered around the stadium so that nobody could drive in with a car full of bombs and get to the base of the stadium at that point. And one of the jobs that was given was we gave the Tampa police the responsibility that at each one of the entrance points, there were 2 Tampa police cars there. And their job was, if they saw somebody driving down the street, barreling down the street like they were going to drive in, their job was to come together and shut the access ramp for them to be able to get in. And there was a rumor out there that somebody was going to steal a police car and fill it with bombs, and that was how they were going to get in. And we all kind of laughed it off, didn't think much about it until the night before the game, somebody stole a police car in St. Pete.
Oh, goodness.
The guys that got put in charge of the responsibility of being in those police cars waiting for it, I'm sure they were very happy when the day was over with.
Oh, my goodness. One of the most compelling memories of that night was, as you mentioned, Whitney Houston, the Whitney Houston's national anthem. What do you remember about how she was selected to do the anthem, and then how did it come about? Just give me your memories of the whole Whitney Houston experience, how she got involved.
Well, the irony is that Whitney was supposed to do the anthem in San Diego in 1988. And we had gotten really far down the road. I remember I'd even gone over to her manager's offices to work on the airplane tickets. And then John Houston, Whitney's father, they fired the manager. And John Houston took over, and all of a sudden she's booked for a tour to go to Australia instead of going to do the Super Bowl. So I guess some people could take that as we'll never talk to her again or something like that. But we went back to her to do it. It was a very interesting process because we were excited about it. We had her, Ricky Minor, who you might remember from, was whatever you want to call it, the orchestra leader for American Idol. And, he was Jay Leno's, band leader, was the guy that produced it for us. We got the Florida Orchestra to be the backup. And so they had to perform everything, although they didn't perform it live. I mean, if you ever watch it and you look at like one of the basses, you'll see it's a skinny piece of cardboard and not the bass that he's playing. But when there was a grave concern by Tagliabue and a few others in the league office that it was not going to be a good rendition. So I remember they were in Buffalo, I think, for the championship game, and they wanted me to send a tape of what it was. So I've got this vision of me having sent the tape up there and them sitting in a car, the cassette player in a car playing this thing. And I get a phone call back and says, we don't think it's appropriate. We want her to re-record it. And I said, okay, well, what happens when she says no? I said, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So came back, and Bob Best, who was producing our pregame for us, we called up John Houston and said, we'd like you to record it. And after you're holding the phone out to about here, we said, okay, well, don't worry about it. It take place. So, and obviously she'd done it in, I can never remember, she did in 4 beats instead of 3 beats or whatever, 3 beats instead of 4 beats or something like that. And the song was so spectacular, it ended up coming out as a single. It's somewhere here in my house, I've got a gold record, from her performance of the Star Spangled Banner.
Yeah.
But, it was special, it'll be remembered, NFL Films capturing the one guy waving the flag in the background with the tears going down his cheek. And, for me, it was a moment I'll never forget because I was standing right next to Carl Banks and Lawrence Taylor, because the next thing after the anthem was the coin toss. And they were supposed to go out, and I can't exactly repeat what Taylor said at the time, because we were standing about 10 feet away, but it had something to do with what he'd like to do to her.
Okay. Well, LT, perfect.
It was a very, very special moment. Bill Barron, who worked with us, worked for NFL Properties, escorted her out and said, she was shaking like a leaf. She was scared to go out there, and the two of them, and remember she made some comment, you want to change places with me at this point. We go out, and I think there's a comment with she makes immediately to Parcells is before she's going out that you want to trade places with what I'm doing out here, and Parcells says, yeah, I'd rather do that than spend the next 3 hours coaching or something. But anyway, it was very, very, very special moment. One that'll live on as probably top 10 for the NFL forever.
So the Whitney Houston anthem, the way she did it, the circumstances that were going on in the world, the all just come together in a perfect way to make it what it became? Or why do you think it resonated so much more than maybe any other anthem we've ever seen? How did this come about the way it did?
I think it's the circumstances more than anything. I think, the country was all pulling together, basically rowing in the same direction. And I think at that point we needed a rallying point. And it was produced so well with her and the background of the Florida Orchestra and the flag and everything else going on there, and it shot, very, very well by ABC. I just think it all came together at the right time in the right place. And, we gave everybody in the stands, in their seat cushion, we gave them all the little mini flags. So they're all waving them, in the stands at that point in time. It was just, and of course, the very end of it, one of the things that happened that wasn't supposed to happen was, we had a helicopter up in the sky the whole period of time, overhead, protecting the skies. And all of a sudden, the pilot of that helicopter decided to do his own flyover, after the anthem. So he buzzed the field right down the middle, which was, everybody thought that was planned, but it wasn't. It was, he did it on his own. So, yeah, I think it caught everybody. It just caught everybody's emotion. Like I said, I think he had a hard time if you were there not having some sort of tears well up as it went on.
Yeah. So after that spectacular beginning, we had a game to remember for the ages. What do you remember about that game, and what made the game so special between the Bills and the Giants?
Well, the Giants, were set in a circumstance that they weren't supposed to get there. It was supposed to be the 49ers. And, they went to Candlestick to play them. And, they went on a Matt Barr field goal at the end of the game. And George Young, who was a dear friend of mine, who was general manager of the team, we talked about it, and they made a decision when they went out to San Francisco. They were going to come straight to Tampa. They were not going to go back to New York. And they did. They landed in Tampa like at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I guess one of the great lines is, we like to bring up Lawrence Taylor at the time, was supposedly they're staying at the Hyatt there on West Shore, and across there was the old Tonga Lounge.
Yes.
You remember that, and now no longer there, I guess. But as they make the turn to go into the hotel, Taylor supposedly stands up and says, "Boys, 15 minutes."
Yeah.
That was where they celebrated their, win over the 49ers. But, they had to hit the ground running right away. And I know Janice Gavazzi, who was George's secretary, was in Tampa as one of the advanced people. And the 49ers, because they always did things to excess, they had to wire everything for the 49ers. Giants were going to use about a tenth of what the 49ers did to everything. So everything in the hotel was wired for offices and things like that for the 49ers. And she said her thrill was going through and telling them, rip that out, rip that out, rip that out. My feeling is the 49ers spent more on infrastructure at that than the Giants did by far, just by getting ready to go in there. So, and then there were all sorts of fun stuff. I mean, for them, the Bills come down, and you probably remember this as media day, which was at the stadium on Tuesday. And the Bills were staying in the Hilton there by the airport, and the Levy did not show up for the media day with everybody, claiming that he got lost on the way from the Hilton to the stadium, which is about 1.5 miles away, and obviously from the top floor of the hotel, you can almost see into the stadium. So I think he paid a fine for that. So that was a little bit. They were a little uptight, to say the least, going into that. So, but I think, and even got to the point that the Giants, because they were practicing University of Tampa, they didn't like the locker room. So they literally built a locker room in the ballroom of the hotel, and they dressed at the hotel and bussed over and played over there.
Yeah.
But then again, the other thing that happened at practice field is a really great story is those were the days before we came in and sodded the field. And we'd always, put grass seed down after the last game. So after, I don't know whether it was the Bucks game or whether it was the bowl game, we sodded the field, and it was not growing very well. Mm-hmm. And after practice on Saturday, I'm out there, and George Toma comes to me and says, "I've got to replace the middle of the field." It's just not holding, and it looks awful. Well, how are you doing? He says, trust me, I've got this all figured out. We'll take care of it. So he went over to the University of Tampa, literally cut the bolts and whatever on the locks, get into the practice field, took the sod out of the middle of the soccer field, took it back over to Tampa Stadium, planted it in the middle field, painted it overnight. Next thing you knew, nobody ever knew that ever took place on the field. But I'm sure when the athletic director or president of the University of Tampa came the next day, looked down at the field, and goes, somebody stole our field. So that was always trust George Tolman. If he said he can get it done, he can get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've heard a lot over the years about the role of sports in terms of healing a country, healing the world when conflicts are going on, and this was another example of that. What do you think the game did for America at that time? How important was it for the national psyche to have an event like that come off the way it did?
Well, I think it was very important because everybody was watching. Like I said, ABC made sure they covered it, but there was nothing that took place. I mean, I guess you could say if the Iraqis were ever going to attack our troops during the Super Bowl, there would have been real hell to play that situation, because the guys were all watching the game, and it probably would have been a good time for them to attack, but they knew better. So everything was quiet that entire Sunday. So I think that it meant a great deal. And I think that's where sports plays this intersection with what takes place. I mean, we can fast forward, 11 years later to Super Bowl 36 after 9/11, which I think is the most important game we ever played, because we changed in a lot of ways kind of what we're going through now. But we changed the psyche of the country then, because we weren't getting on airplanes and we weren't going to big events and things like that. Once you proved you could pull the Super Bowl off, we kind of got back up on our feet again. So I think it does play this part, especially when you got something that 120 million people in the country are watching, it means something to them, how everything's pulled off. And I think the tone of the game was right in it. And of course, maybe if it was going to be 55-17, it would have been different. The fact that it was 20-19 and shoot the game. My biggest thing at the end of the game was after they kicked the field goal, there was still like 7 seconds left to go in the game. And I'll never forget at that point in time where, we bring Tagliabue and everybody down, and he goes in the locker room, to be able to present the trophy, and he goes into the Bills locker room. And my decision was, I think I'm going to go make sure everything's okay in the Giants locker room, just in case, this happens. And of course, then, the field goal's missed, and all of a sudden everybody's running to the Giants. But I ran out in the field. I had to chase photographers off the field in order to get the last 7 seconds played. But there's a lot of the other fun part of the memory of that was after the game, go through everything, all the press conferences and that sort of stuff. And it's maybe an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half after the game. I don't know why I did this. I walked down in the locker rooms, and I walked through the Giants locker room. And there in the locker room, there's tape all over the place, and there's crap everywhere. And sitting in the middle of the room on a table is the trophy. Everybody's gone. So
yeah,
I took the trophy home, and I called George, and I said, are you guys missing anything? Anything that you think that you don't have, from the game? So it's ironic because there was one other time the trophy was left behind at a Super Bowl, and that was when the Jets won. So, maybe it's a New York tradition.
Yeah, maybe so. I know we had talked about this before several years ago, and you'd mentioned the fact you were surprised that no one had written a book about this game, about the whole experience. It was the kind of tale that would be compelling enough to carry a book. So all these years later, being part of that, what is your biggest takeaway from being part of Super Bowl 25, whether it was the anthem, the security, the game itself, and having the moment of, hey, we did this, we did it successfully and it worked. What all these years later, what do you remember most about the whole thing from start to finish, and the fact that you pulled it off?
I think you're exactly it, that we did pull it off, and we did it in a short period of time, and we did it properly and did everything. It's funny. You just made me think of one of my memories of that was Monday after the game. I took my son out to the stadium and I had him play Steeg and Baker, and I threw him a touchdown pass in the corner of the end zone, where Baker caught the touchdown pass. But yeah, it was all those things that came together. And it was a scary time. I mean, for example, we were all worried about, the gas that they could have had, so we went out and bought all the antidote we could find in the country to be able to counter whatever poison gas was put out there. But we only had enough for like 7,500 people. And I remember one of our medical guys coming to me says, "We want to know where you are all the time, because if that happens, we want to come inoculate you right away." And I said, "No, I want to be last, because if this happens, I don't want to spend the rest of my life giving depositions." But we ended up taking that serum, and we sold it off to the NBA for the NBA All-Star game, and I think they sold it off to the NCAA for the Final Four. And I don't know who ended up with it last, but it went through a lot of hands that way. But I think it was the fact that all the people, and Tampa was a special place, that came together and got out to solve problems. And it was not. It's funny, as you get ready for a game, you've got, probably had 3 years to get ready, and you go through all these planning meetings and everybody thinking how we could do this. When push comes to shove and you've got to make decisions now and you don't debate them, I think that's what really makes it important. And there's not a debate about what was going to take place. This is how we're going to do it. Let's go march and get it done. And there was not a lot of argument, a lot of discussion about things. And I think we made a lot of really right decisions. And, I think that the people that came to the game enjoyed it. And I think the people that watched it on TV, it gave them a respite of what was going on. Maybe understood how important, sports is to our society.
That was Super Bowl 25, a game we'll never forget. Giants beat the Bills 20-19 amid world conflict, the Gulf War going on, and the game changed so many things from security to game presentation, and it remains one of probably the NFL's shining moments, Super Bowl 25. Jim Steeg, thanks so much for spending time with us. We appreciate it. And he's Jim Steeg, the former Senior Vice President of Special Events for the NFL. We'll hear more from him in the series, where he can talk about all of his experiences building the Super Bowl into the great event that it has become. On behalf of Siegel Speakers, I am Joey Johnston, and we'll look forward to talking to you next time.